My name is David Patten, and I was raised in the Druidic tradition in North American continent. And that's a different, most people think that most Druids or most people who follow the Celtic path are from Great Britain, Ireland, or Scotland. But I was raised in Montana on the Native American reservation. So I was raised with two different schools, the school of my forefathers, which had to be the Celtic Druidic tradition, and that of the Blackfeet Indian. Since then, I've gone on and got my doctorate in philosophy, and I taught at the university level for a while. And then after about 2 or 3 years of teaching, I decided in 1973 that I needed to take up with the spiritual training that I had been given as a child very early on. And so I went back to Montana and spent 15 years studying the wisdom of the forest, studying the myth structure, the language. And my work today revolves around trying to decode the old Celtic library, trying to find out what these stories and what these instruments of spirituality we know of in spiritual life in the Celtic traditions is all about. Part of that is the understanding of what we mean by the divine. In the Celtic tradition, we have, if you will, a before-Christian and an after-Christian phenomena in these traditions. In both cases, the Madonna figures very, very strongly. The goddess figures very strongly in their view of nature, view of the divine. One thing that intrigues me very much is the different colors that they talk about of the goddess in the myths. You have a white goddess, you have a red goddess, you have a black goddess. And what is implied by these different colors of goddesses or prime forces is quite different. If we think of the goddess as, in the ancient world, we used to think of anything that was formless, that which is formless, out of which everything arises and towards which everything goes, we call the goddess. And that is immortal. The source and destiny of all things is the immortal. And we used to call that the goddess. The gods are that which have taken form. And so if you see a form, any form has the masculine element, and it is not immortal in the sense that all form is here for the moment and gone. It goes back, if you will, into the cauldron, into that source from which all things arise. Now that meant that anything that is, any form, anything that is present is very precious because it's here just for a small moment. But that the living force behind that form, that which gives it birth and that which takes it at the end and that which breathes the divine breath into it is the goddess. The different colors of the goddess have to do with what kind of influence this background, this living breath is giving to a particular form. For example, the white goddess is associated with wisdom, a lot of wisdom. Now, wisdom to the Celtic tradition is not one of knowing things. In the Celtic tradition, if you've lost your innocence, you cannot be wise. And so a person who thinks he knows it all or has figured everything out is one that isn't necessarily wise. Well, the white goddess has to do with keeping the wisdom about you. The root word for wisdom is the wits, and the wit is the spirits. So to keep one's wits about one is to keep the spirit of all that has ever been and all that ever will be around you. And insofar as you can tap into these spirits, all these teachers, you are wise. This comes under the rubric of the white goddess. The red goddess is one of excitement. This is the one of passion. The red god is the one of war and lovemaking. But now the black goddess is the one that really has piqued my interest for an awful lot. The black goddess is primarily the main color of source and destiny. She is beyond anyone's ability to capture definitively. She'll make her appearance in any way, shape, or form when she desires. She appears as different images in different cultures, changes in ours. Sometimes she appears as very gentle, as a lot of the Black Madonnas in later Christianity has depicted her. Sometimes she's depicted as the very notion of hell itself, because she's so ferocious. We may think of her in the old sense of the Gaelic giant that used to scare people in the mythologies, was Yasbadanan. And Yasbadanan literally means she of the deep bliss. And in a lot of the mythology, he's now called a he is this terrible, terrible facade who scares children. Yasbadanan is a word meaning the hawthorn tree. And the hawthorn tree used to be called the May tree. Yasbadanan is the May Queen. Now the May Queen was called by those who had been initiated into her deepest wisdom, her deepest mysteries, she of the deep bliss. To those people who are on the outside and have not understood her existence everywhere, in all things, she may appear to be the terrible one. The word for May in Gaelic is awath, and awath in Hebrew, wath means terrible, and wath in Gaelic means terrible. But those who have been initiated into the mysteries of the May Queen, the Black One, have always seen her as she of the deep bliss. For she is the great defender of boundaries. She is the defender of the limits. She gave birth to limits, and she takes the limits away. And she's the great defender. The thing about the month of May, a lot of people don't realize, is the meditation that happens during this month of the Hawthorn, the Black Queen, is that marriage is not allowed. Sexuality is not allowed. Because what she wants people to experience is the deep, dark interior of their own lives. And so she's usually depicted with her eyes closed and her mouth closed. And she is of the dark, she is of the deep, from which all things come. So she is a defender of virginity. She's a defender of the innocent. She's a defender of those people who must be judges and those people who must be policemen. She's a defender of that situation that you must enter to be able to transform yourself. So for some, she's looked at as a very terrible visage. Athena of the Greek tradition was the defender of the boundaries, and sometimes her shield was that of the Gorgon shield. To look upon it meant death. This is the mystery schools used to have these shields in front to protect the interior secrets of these schools from the uninitiated. And so the task of purification the task of going within, the task of trying to find a better way, trying to find the deep reason for all things is involved with the Black Goddess. And we ignore her at our peril. I think for many, many years now, we have tried to pretend that this force that creates and takes away is a benign force, that she's just wonderful and that she can be manipulated. We can control her coming and going. We can determine the future. Oh, it's up to us. Well, in an important way, the future is up to us. Insofar as we acknowledge this force of the universe, this principle of all nature. In the Celtic world, we say that it's the union of three aspects of the divine, of nature, and of humanity. And when those three are together, we have something called reality. When they are separated, we have illusion. And if we look close enough, we'll find the divine in nature. If we want to know what the Black Goddess really is, we will look to nature. We will not just look to what we want, to our own will. And if it looks frightening at first, it should be. But I assure you that once one has learned to tap into this awesome force and understand that she is something of great bliss, it is no longer frightening. Death itself is no longer frightening. I think one of the reasons that we find similarities in culture all over the world, especially in the material that's now coming forward from the pre-Christian, pre-Islamic era, is that what we're finding is that it's not so much an evidence that people had to meet face to face to exchange information, so much as when one is living so closely with the goddess, if you will, with nature, and so that you start to notice what effects things have. When you sit under a hawthorn tree, for example, you have a certain feeling, a certain set of thoughts, that it doesn't matter whether you're Indian or African or Egyptian, it doesn't matter. You will have the same kind of orientation that, by the way, is different than sitting under an oak tree. And a certain time of year, you will have a certain kind of attitude towards things. And so when you start to see the patterns, the cycles of the seasons, what is influencing you, and you watch how the young people come in and how older people go out, you start to see the patterns. And all religion in the earlier times was based upon the recognition of these patterns, these shifts of her manifestation. Like you find it in Ecclesiastes, where there's a season for everything under heaven. You bar nothing out. Everything has its place. Everything has its time. And so when we find that people have shared a particular color combination, for example, in India there's the red and the white and the black as well. And you find that all over. It has to do with the understanding of what redness is about, what blackness is about, and what whiteness is about. And anyone who's tuned in to nature, tuned into their own cycles of life, will understand, and they don't need to even exchange information. We've kind of got away from this. In the modern world, we believe that what has to do with what I believe. And so it's a level of what I think. But in the ancient world, God is beyond belief. Something beyond belief. She is, whether we believe in her or not, the patterns of the universe come and go. There are births and there are deaths. No matter what we believe, she is not dependent upon our belief structure. And so if you look at the old cultures around the world, you're going to find an awful lot of similarities. The Navajo tradition have the same sequence of their 13. They have 13 months in their year, and each month has a certain color combination, and that color combination matches the old Celtic year of 13 months exactly. Now we could conclude that somehow the Celts and the Navajos got together somewhere along the line, and then we start to look for historical evidence for that. Or we could understand that both Celts and the Navajo people live very close to the earth, very close to nature, and they both believe that the divine resides in the things of nature. And that's why you have to listen very carefully to everything that happens, because it's all a message. It's all something that is part of the wisdom structure. And she'll speak in many, many different ways. Sometimes where you least expect it. Usually, you least expect it. I remember traveling in Indonesia one time, and I was traveling with a woman, and I was a young man, and I thought I was, at this time of my life where I thought I was God's gift to women. And anyway, it must have been in my bodily structure, the way I presented myself to the world. But this old woman, she must have been about 80 years old. She saw me walking through the streets of Bandung, and she grinned, and she pulled her clothes off right in the middle of town and offered herself to me, you know, as if to say, well, big boy. And I couldn't get rid of her. For 2 hours, she stayed in front of me wherever I would go. And it was like the lesson that I needed at that time. She appears to us, the black one appears to us in many forms. And a lot of times the stories will talk about an old crone who offers herself to a young hero to see what the young hero will do. If the young hero is appalled by it, it doesn't fit his notion of beauty, he may give up a great gift. He may turn his back on his great opportunity. And a lot of the Celtic stories has her then turning into a young, beautiful princess or something. But the point is that especially the ugly ones, especially that which you don't expect and is outside of your safe little belief structure, that's the one you need to look at, because she rarely comes to you within your own belief structure. She comes to you terrifyingly at times, sometimes. She is transformation personified, because life is transformational. It gets hooked up, caught up, and if she's about anything, she's about life. She's the living force, the divine breath. It's not necessarily about wisdom. It's very much about life. I teach a thing with the alphabet. It used to be called the Oghams. And if we look at Alpha and Omega, she is the Alpha. Al means life. Fa means light. A lot of the language has to do with understanding the sounds of what we are saying. One of my favorite examples is the word hello. In the Asian Indian tradition, they have a word like namaste. And namaste is a blessing. And you hear it everywhere. We don't think of the word hello as a blessing. But if we were to examine each sound and understand the mantra from which it came in the Celtic tradition, we'd understand, for example, that the H is an honorific. It's like, that when we pronounce the H, sometimes we pronounce it, sometimes we don't, but in each case, it's like, it's a stopping of the breath, as if one is before the great wonder So anytime you have a word with an H in it, it is an honoring. What follows is an honor or a welcoming. It sets off as special and sacred, that which follows. And then the E in hello, it's the old letter of rest. We used to call it the divine breath. And L is the old tree of life in the Celtic tradition, which was the rowan tree. You've heard a lot of the stories about the rowan tree. Together, the EL is the oldest name of God that we know of. When Jesus' last words were Eli, Eli, he's referring to this ancient form of the God, which was the living God. And the living God that rests on the seventh day. That's where the E comes in. The second L in hello really accentuates that we're talking about life here. So HELL is honor the living God. The O that we put on the end of hello. In any language, anytime you have an O in the words we speak, it refers to fire, it refers to initiation, insight, the sun, anything that will introduce us into its inner secrets, its inner light. So when we say hello, we basically are saying to each other, honor the living God's initiation. We're welcome to life. And that's the meaning of the word hello. If we contrast that with hi, hi. Hi is another valuable word. But again, you have the H, which is the honorific, and the letter I, which means death. And so with the word hi, what we say, we always say it when we're in a hurry. We were trying to convey that we don't have time to talk. We say, let's honor the shortness of life. Yeah, because we don't have the time to spend lots of it. So we say hi when we're honoring this short time as I'm passing. Well, life and death and light, these are all part of the goddess. And seen from her perspective, one doesn't take precedence over the other. Life and death. Death, in the Celtic traditions, there are a series of wombs. You have the womb of your mother, and you have the tomb of the earth. And you go through from one life to another life to another life. What seems to be a tomb from one perspective is a womb from another perspective. And so that all life and death is the same. And it is a series of births. It's a series of transformations. In the West, we're concerned about the loss of ego. Ego is like the sun. It rises in the morning, it sets at night. And where it goes, we have certain people think they can tell us. But she is always with us. And our deepest self is not our ego. Our ego has a beginning and an end, and she has neither a beginning or an end. In my life, in one very important sense, has no beginning or end. It's only what I think has a beginning and an end, and what I believe. The notion of Mary goes very, very far. It goes back way before the historical person called Jesus Christ. Mary literally means of the sea. The old, in the Sumerian and the Egyptian and the Celtic traditions, a double A, meant literally of the deep, and the meaning of the sea. She of the sea is the one that produces, that all things come out of the sea. The Celtic people always call themselves the people of the sea. They're Mary's people. And so she of the deep bliss, another word for her is Mary. There are three Marys. We talk about the Mother Mary. We talk about the bride Mary, and we talk about the one who lays us out and takes our body when we die. In the Celtic traditions, these Marys keep popping up. They're all over the place, and they're all of the sea. The sea is our home. And we mean this metaphorically, in the sense that it is of the deep. We are not of the surface. We are of the deep. We are of deep space. We are of the deep waters. We are not what we seem to be. We seem to be a figure that has flat feet, that our energy is only in this one small space, that we are just here. But insofar as we partake of the womb we came from, we are forever. It's hard for me to separate myself from eternity. I think it is for everyone. It's too terrifying to think of ourselves as separate. A lot of the alienation today stems from the fact that much of our education says that we are separate. And at some level, we all know that we're not separate. We're not. And so we are alienated not to the goddess, not to the universe and the world, but we're alienated to our training, our schools, and our culture that insists upon our separateness. We don't feel separate. We know that's a lie. So many of the times when we get frightened, we make overstatements. And modern man is very, very frightened. And we're always making overstatements. I'm thinking about some of the pagan people now who cherish, say, May Day. May Day and the May Day festivals, and the old word is Beltane. During Beltane, historically, rules are sort of suspended. The rules of society. And what it is a recognition that in passion, when it comes to love and passion, what rules are we following here? There aren't any. It's just like, it doesn't apply to me, But on the other side of the calendar, 182 days after the Beltane festivals, we have Samhain, or Halloween. And that occurs in another month, another manifestation, one that insists upon the rules, the divine rules, the rules of the universe, and that you must die. There are some rules you cannot break. And your time on earth is part of that rule. And so, in our enthusiasm, sometimes we make only half of the statement. But yes, it's true. We have freedom. We have freedom in that time of year of May, early May, when, like all the flowers and the trees, were just popping out all over. But we also stand for, we are the defenders of the law. And not just the laws that man makes, but the laws of God. The law that things must come to be, and that they must pass beyond. That things come and go, and there's nothing fixed in concrete in terms of what man's understanding is. Things change. But there is a law. Concerning Chartres, and Chartres Cathedral in France, I'm primarily of this continent, and the dragon on this continent is a brand new dragon. It's, well, not new, but it's very vigorous. And when my forefathers came here and brought the Druidic tradition here, they had concluded that the European dragon was pretty tired, and that it was getting a little dirty and dusty. And they found on this continent a very lively one. And so we've been concerned about finding those power centers here that would help us to understand the magnitude of the goddess material. But in Europe, which I'm not really greatly familiar with, but I do know that Chartres Cathedral was a center the Druidic college. And there were many in Europe, but that was a very big one. We might say that for graduate training, they sent them to England, and they did. But it depends on the kind of training that you were accomplishing. As you probably know, a Druid's training starts with the Bardic training, the learning of the alphabet, the learning of the Oghams. And this is a memorizing verbatim of the legends, of the stories and poems. A change of a single note would change the library. So they had to learn these things. And then they had to go through a period of learning what it was to be in the wilderness. By the way, the word wilderness has to do with the will of the land. That's what the word means, which is bigger than our own will. A Druid's training then would go beyond the rote memory of the bards, and then he would have to take up with the mathematics, the sacred geometry, the astronomy, the astrology, different aspects of his training. He would have to travel. They were known to travel. The Druids are known to have traveled all over the planet. They spent a lot of time in India. They were the professional students, if you will, as well as the judges. Well, Chartres was one of the main colleges that had to do with the learning of mathematics, and had to learn the great pattern that's on the floor of the temple right now. Was placed there, I think it was in the 12th century, by stonemasons who, probably unbeknownst to the church, were the living reminder of an earlier time. So the Dramanon is a sacred walking meditation, and you can put a pattern out on the floor anywhere in woods to do this walking pattern, but at some time in your life you need to walk that pattern, because by the time you got to the middle of it, you will have the peace and tranquility that it takes to understand the eternity of all that is. It is one of the most powerful meditations that the Celtic world developed. And we find it even over in Turkey, where the Celtic peoples at one time were. They're the same stock, by the way, as the Hittites. Celtic people go back a long time, and they inherited a culture in Europe that preceded them by a very long time. And I think a lot of the black goddess material came from this earlier people. The Celts came into Europe I'd say about 2,600 years, and we may quibble over a couple of thousand years, but everybody admits that they did inherit a very, very advanced civilization that was already in Europe when the Celtic people came in. We know of them as the Longheads, these early pre-Celtic peoples, and they're the ones who built the Grange, the New Grange, and Stonehenge. And in all probability had been the one that had worked out the wisdom that we now know as Celtic for many, many tens of thousands of years beforehand. We call them the Africans. They came from North Africa. And they dominated Europe for much longer than we can have claimed that ourselves. Very peaceful, goddess-oriented people. It depends on where people can enter into the understanding. If they understand it in terms of the black goddess, in terms of a human female, fine. If they understand it in terms of a skin color, fine. But you can enter into this issue at any level. You might think of the black goddess as the earth, because that soil that produces our food it has a tendency to be black and brown. The humus in human is black. And so, but people have to enter however they can. If they see the black goddess as a white male, that's okay too. She makes her appearance in many forms because she is the breath behind it. She is the life force behind all images. And so it's not whether someone is male or female in the human form, or black or white or pink or yellow. It doesn't matter. She'll make her appearance in all forms, in any form she wishes. I think part of the understanding in the ancient world was that which is immortal and forever was the formless. And we see that in many different traditions. The void, we call it, that what one is trying to find in the spiritual life is that which is formless, that which is forever. Because we understand forms to be very point specific. You know, they're there for a moment and then they're gone. And many, many different images have come and gone in human history. And we kind of laugh at them after they've gone. While we believe in them, we treat them as very sacred relics. But what we're really looking at when we treat something as very sacred is that which is eternal in them. So what is eternal about an image of Jesus Christ, for example, or an image of the Buddha? We know there's something eternal there. And yet the depiction of Jesus and of the Buddha changes. Anyone who's studied the statuary of Buddha and Jesus has found that every 100 years or so, the depiction of these people change. And it doesn't matter, because what we're really looking for is the immortal. What is really at the deep bliss of these people. And that's what we'll call the goddess. And so when we would take a particular image and say, well, it has to be this shape for us to cherish it. What we've done is taken the eternal out of it and say, no, we're going to just cherish what is now. And so to say that the goddess is an American female or a California female is absurd, in the sense that unless that California female partakes in the immortal, then, and we all do. So I'm trying to avoid the problem of that a lot of Western people have done, and that's to take an image for the real thing, an idol for the real thing. And we've done that for years, and we don't need to do it anymore. It's killing us. And so no matter what the image is that you prefer, I ask you to look at what is eternal in there, what is really the life force, rather than whether it's male or female or black or white. And that's really important, I think, for our survival as a people. In the Egyptian tradition, they used to talk about the netters. And a netter is the root word for our word natures. And a netter is a god or a goddess. Right? And what we're speaking of when we're speaking of Egyptian gods is certain manifestations, certain tendencies, like you have, like in the Tibetan traditions, you have a god of passion, and then you have a god of destruction, and you have these different modes that we can take. They're faces of the goddess, if you will. So when I say that there are a lot of different faces of the goddess, it doesn't mean that certain faces won't appeal to you personally more than other faces will. And it's not going to be universal. Some people will be attracted to the white goddess or the red goddess, depending on where they are at in their individual development. Sexuality, for example, is a biggie for a lot of people. And this red goddess is very, very important. And that's what makes them do their oblation. They are worshippers of this goddess. To someone like myself, the white goddess or the black goddess is, at my age, in my experience, is far more, appeals to me more than the red one does now. And you walk along the beach and you're looking out onto the ocean. Something happens in your thoughts and your feelings. No matter who you are, when you're walking along that beach, you have a tendency to lose your speech, to get lost in your deepest thoughts, your deepest memories. And contrast that, say, with being around a mountain brook, where you hear all this, the really high bubbly of the brook, and your mind becomes extremely excited, and it's a place of new ideas. You get new ideas about what you all do in your life. You go to the ocean for one reason, and you go to the brook for another reason. And people will respond somewhat differently, but mostly when we want to just go deep, we'll go to the ocean. When we want a new inspiration, we'll go to a brook. It's true, the great healing wells of Europe had to do an awful lot with the Black Madonna. But this is not to be surprised. All landmarks belong to her, whether it's a high mountain or whether it's a main tree. Most tribes would have a tree that they would identify the life of the tribe with that tree. And because you see, in a moving people, the goddess is forever. She is always there. She is in that well. She's in that mountain. And that was important not to lose her. If you went to the next valley, you would find a different well, but it wouldn't be necessarily the well you were familiar with. And so the goddess is always, the black one, is always associated with the landmarks, especially springs. Now the fire is a different thing. The fire can be moved. And that has a whole different connotation in the Bible. I don't believe we have to, when we go back into our memory, things get darker. But that doesn't mean that things are darker, in fact, in our past. A very interesting thing about the notion of the Celtic spirituality, the thing about the goddess. Time is a manifestation of one's own belief structure.
Wait, I'm sorry. Okay.
Well, time is a manifestation of one's own thoughts. If you can think of time being a stack of simultaneous events, that we live on all dimensions at once, not just in time, but in terms of place. You represent to me an aspect of myself. You see an aspect of me that I don't see. There's an aspect of me that's living in the 13th century that I live out in my head. I live out in my body. Much of the work now being done in multiple personalities is revealing that we do live on multiple levels of time and space. Well, to the ancient world, that was not a surprise because they didn't have a notion of beginning and ending. It was always in the middle. We're always in the middle. Well, when you're taken up with the goddess material really reinforces that we are always in the middle. We are in the middle of the universe. And the universe, the edge of the universe is the edge of our own body. That we don't occupy a specific point of view, like a war god might. A war god represents a particular tribe, and that's all he represents. Or a belief god represents a particular belief, and that's all he represents. We're talking about a force that is behind everything that happens. There is nothing that happens outside of this force. And that force is not restricted to our notions of time and place. In modern physics today, in quantum physics, they're discovering these same principles. The simultaneity of event. It's almost like we're living in a hall of mirrors. And Athena's mirror had to do with that. The black one. Athena is the black one. And she's teaching us. what is it we mean by reality? She's inviting us to the question of what is, rather than assume we know and then plan tomorrow. Let's put tomorrow on hold and find out what this moment is. All spirituality has to do with that particular question. Mythologically, the serpent has to do with the winds. It depicts the winds. If you remember some of your old Greek stories, the beginning of the world started with the union of the wind and night. Night being the mother of all, and the wind, especially the north wind, was the one that she created to dance with her. The serpent is the one that is the instigation of material reality. It's his shedding of his skin that creates the illusion of particular times and places. And so, if you will, he's the father of us all, the serpent. We know of him in a lot of Christian mythology as the firstborn. He's the firstborn. You've probably heard in Celtic mythology of the thrice born, the three-born. The firstborn is of the deep. And he's usually depicted in pre-Christian times as being part fish or part sea monster. And the fish, or in the Celtic tradition, was the Dylan, which is operant to the word Magdalene, Mary Magdalene. Meg means the womb or fortress of the Dylan, the firstborn. And the firstborn always goes to his father's land immediately in mythology. He doesn't hang around on this planet. He goes back to the deep. And then you have the secondborn. The secondborn is the king. He is the one who will reign on this planet. And when we talk about Jesus as the king, we're speaking of the secondborn. He was also the firstborn. But then we have the thriceborn, the threeborn, the one who is born out of the womb of wisdom. But these are all aspects of the goddess. The firstborn has to do with the black one, the birth into life. The serpent is involved with this because the serpent is the instigation. One of the reasons we think of the serpent is he loses his skin, he goes through one life, and you think, well, there's his corpse. But no, he's moved on and grown another skin. Well, in a very real sense, this is sort of a personification of what we are like. I have an ego that fits this day. Tomorrow, I will shed that skin just like the serpent and go on to the next one. If people have problems with transformational life, they will have problems with the notion of the serpent. A gleeman is the one who will write a poem to make glee, to make someone feel good. Like if a person who's paying him, for example. So there's a lot of stories about cherishing this warrior over that one and his accomplishments. A bard, on the other hand, has only one patron, and that's the goddess. And he is a troublesome person to have around because you would like him to be domesticated and tame, but he's in love with her. And he's not going to be satisfied with a human female or a ruler or a particular religion. He is in love with this divine force that is forever. And as a reward, that old phrase, throwing the jawbones of asses down below her nest. She takes her lovers, and she picks them clean and drops their jawbones. The whole notion of the ass is the one who loves her. It's a symbol of the one who engages in this great love, which comes out in poetry. Poetry has only one purpose, and that is to sing the praises of that which is everywhere and forever. And there's no other point for poetry. The gleeman may want to make somebody feel good so that he could be paid or rewarded in some way. But when you look at the difference between the work of a true bard that makes everyone filled with a feeling of grace and gift, and grief. These are all aspects of the goddess. You've got to sometimes pay attention to what is not mentioned. When a tradition doesn't mention the goddess at all, look for some underpinning of some great understanding or some suspicions that they may be afraid of. The Native American traditions have a long list of very sacred places, and it's not something that is just specific to their tribe. Power places are not picked because it's an agreement. They're picked because somebody has found a tremendous feeling there, a tremendous connection that they have with more than just their lives. You take Mount Shasta, for example. There isn't very, very many people who can go to that mountain and feel some incredible connection. They see the different lights. They see reality takes on a different form for them just to walk up on that mountain. But there are a lot of these sites, and we're losing a lot of them because our people have a tendency, Americans have a tendency to be less connected with nature and the divine than any other people in the world. And the Native Americans are getting few and far between, and even among them, they're not really regarding or cherishing their medicine people, their spiritual people. And so much of this is being lost. It's a shame. But it's not passed just culturally, it's passed on your attunement. Anyone who has explored the deep bliss within themselves will be able to recognize these sites, these places, instantly. It's not a mystery. You don't have to speak the Blackfoot tongue to know them. You just have to know your deepest self. You have to know this connection that you have with the universe. One of the reasons Christianity developed in Europe so quickly with the Celtic Church, Celtic Christianity, was that if you'll examine some of what we understand as Christianity, we find its roots, its historical roots within the Celtic belief structure of the Celtic people. The notion of a Christos, of a divinely anointed king, for example. The notion of a Mary, the notion of Immaculate Conception. These are all notions that precede historical Jesus. So the church took off, the Celtic Church took off in Europe 400 or 500 years before the Roman Church did. In fact, Europe was Christianized before the Roman Church came into Europe. And one of the greatest examples in the 2nd century, there was a Roman writer who wrote that the Celts were fighting under a banner of Esus, E-S-U-S. And it was a particular god of the Celts who hung their gods in trees. Well, part of it is that we don't want to see the connection here. I mean, we're talking about an army that was fighting as Christians against the Romans at a time when the Romans were writing about how barbarian these Celtic peoples were. But the Irish church established their monasteries throughout Europe long before the Roman Church came up into Europe to conquer them. And conquer them they did at the point of a sword. And the many thousands of Christian prelates that died as a result of this invasion is a story we have to tell yet. But part of it is because early Christianity and the pre-Christians had not that much difference. There were much they shared in common. So it's only of late that we have a divergence between the goddess people and Christianity. I think part of it is shifting notions of what we mean by Jesus' mission and why he came to earth. Everything about Jesus' life in the Bible goes back to that E-L, Elizabeth, Elijah, the E-L, Eli, Eli. So many of these names in the Bible means that the writers of this in Christ's message has to do with this earlier God, not a war God, not the God of a particular belief structure, but if you will, the womb. El means womb. And it's this God, this this one of birth and death. That birth and death are very important. Well, normally we think of birth and death as feminine functions. It's not something that on a sociological level a man can do. So men have always been concerned about transcendence. The male aspect of this union between male and female has to do with transcendence. What is forever? Well, birth and death on the one hand, transcendence on the other, we have here a possibility of a great awakening where the union of transcendence and birth and death are brought together in a way of life and death. Or we have the makings of a great fight between, on the one hand, the cycles of birth and death, and on the other, transcendence. Modern religions, historical religions, what we call traditional religions, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, stresses transcendence at the price of birth and death. They, if you will, taken the masculine view of things and treated that as primary. And so that which would represent the birth and death one, the endless cycles of life, etc., is viewed upon with a little bit of suspicion because it interferes with transcendence. Well, in early Christianity, they did not see Christ as a choice between transcendence and birth and death. It was that mystical union that one receives transcendence, the immortal, in birth and death. Mistakes are never made. When people think or they feel, there's no feeling or thinking that's ever a mistake. We will always reflect our surroundings. And when we live in desperate times, we have desperate thoughts. I'll take a case in point. In the very early pre-Christian era, for many, many years, there was a Bronze Age. And the whole point of bronze is you mixed pure metals. Everything about their spiritual life was you separated the metals and you purified them. Everything had to be purified. The best materials would be your best rulers, your best priests, your best farmers, your best weapons. Then iron was introduced. Iron is not a metal that when you purify it is strong. Iron is strong when you pollute it. When you throw garbage into it, it gets stronger. And iron became a metal of the people. And soon peoples were forced around. Whole tribes were moved around in the sense that they'd taken years and years to go 10 miles before. Now they were being shoved all over the place with armies, and their wise people were being murdered. Their leaders were being shot up or taken away. And so they needed a religion that would express their desperateness. When we're speaking of Europe, we're speaking of a time when there was very little upsettiveness. Until the Roman Empire, until Julius Caesar, there was not much in the way of disruption. The seasons came and gone. It was just like it had always been, and they could have a full panoply of belief, and they could say without hesitation, there's a time for everything under heaven. But with the arrival of the Roman armies and the arrival of iron within their midst, that's just no longer true. Now you lose your Druids, now you lose your bards, your kings are gone, everything is mixed up, and people are moved around, you don't recognize the landscape. And so with time, the memory of this earlier time, when things are easier, starts to fade. And all you have to go on is the old stories of what it might have been. And the ones who would interpret those stories are fast growing old. So you have to reinterpret the stories in your new light. Well, early Christianity, as it went into Europe, especially around the Glastonbury area, in which there's some speculation that the Glastonbury Church began within 15 years of Christ's death, much earlier than any of the Greek churches, much earlier than Paul. So they could understand a peaceful Christ and how everything fit, not just the male part, but the female parts. For the ancient Celt, for example, sound was the world. Word and world. One of the reasons these words are alike is that the whole world is born in our mouth. As I am born in the world is born in my mouth. It's in our words. And so you could represent the feminine, for example, in their chant had to do around with the AI sound. Ai, ai, these are chants that are used at birth and at death. The O-U-E ones are primarily masculine verbs, sounds. And so when you, within the language, you use combinations of these things. The early Christian church spent a lot with singing. What came to be known as the Gregorian chants was primarily a Celtic phenomenon before it was robbed as a principle by Pope Gregory and claimed, in his name. But it existed in these Celtic monasteries hundreds of years before Pope Gregory. And their notion of Christianity, for example, was you make your commitment with God yourself. You see God everywhere. If you find that sexuality is part of your spiritual practice, so be it. There isn't anyone that tells you one way or another. And so their monasteries in the early days would be, your commitment is with God and God alone. It's not with the abbot. It's not with some understanding or some rule system. It is between you and God. And you have to make that bed, and you pay nobody else is going to pay the price. You're the only one. And so you have to work with what you have to work with. And that was early Christianity. It was only later that in these rough times when there was no mastery, everybody was a victim of whatever was happening, the people started to think in terms of mastery. How do I master nature so that it doesn't hurt me? How do I master the next door neighbor so he doesn't hurt me? And so the notion of mastery becomes stronger and stronger and stronger. Transcendence becomes, as an issue, becomes more strong. And so we get into our period, which is a period of abject terror. Notions of mastery is very big, very big. And it's primarily as a defense mechanism, but it unfortunately is defending that which is bound to pass away. It's not the eternal that's being defended here. So mastery as an issue, has a tendency to be arising out of a situation of terror, and we live in terror. Modern life is a life of terror. It's not a question of going back to the goddess in such times, just merely that. We have to find that inner bliss. We have to find the bliss not just inside, but in our lives. You can't go sell things all day and then expect not to have a garbage problem at night. We have to integrate the inside and the outside. We have to integrate what we mean by bliss. We have to acknowledge things. I take people sometimes to Bali, which is in Indonesia. And the island of Bali is just a pleasure. Anybody should go there. But their temples there are mostly dedicated to the god Shiva, or the goddess Shiva, if you want to go back far enough. And Shiva is not the one that we have a tendency to cherish over here, or is cherished very much in northern India. Krishna and Vishnu are stronger, and Shiva is just this wild one, the source of all things is Shiva, representing war. When war appears, that's Shiva. Then when crisis comes, that's Shiva coming, announcing him or herself. Well, most of their temples in Bali are dedicated to Shiva. And they make offerings to this temple every day. Every day they go to the temple. And they make an offering as if to say anger, I acknowledge your presence in my life. And I cherish your presence. Now here's a gift. Leave me alone. And contrast that to our times when we say, there is no anger in me. Yeah, and it's not necessarily pleasant. I mean, you can't master her. That's the point I'm trying to make. If I gave her 20 tons of oranges, will she treat me nice? You know, it's just, it doesn't work that way. It's like you may give her 20 tons of oranges and she'll give you cancer. Because we have to start to see that these gifts that we get, like cancer, it's a gift. You know, we can paint it as a terrible thing. This horrible Athena face, this face of serpents just devouring us. Or we can see it as a doorway into a very special gift. Anyone who's worked with people who have suffered from AIDS reports the same thing. The people who have suffered from AIDS and they get rejected by all their previous communities, and they have to spend a lot of time on their own, they all seem to discover inside some special message, some special something that the rest of us are not privy to. They deal with this message in different ways, sometimes with anger, or sometimes with real bliss. But it's a message. They've discovered that this gift, this thing, see, gifts don't have to be really nice. Gifts can be anything. And that gift could change your life. It could make you live for the first time in your life for a moment. And you may not have years, but you got that moment. And you didn't have that moment before. You had years, but you didn't have that moment. And so we need to start seeing that illness is not necessarily a bad thing. That it's an opportunity. It's a doorway. It's a way of understanding even more what life is about. An invitation, if you will, to a bigger life. We used to think of illness. The ancient world, without exception, thinks of illness as a matter of bad breath, bad breathing. You're not breathing right. Your lifestyle is such that you practice breathing. I mean, you're doing something that's interfering with your breathing. About the time of Christ, we started to change that notion. And we started to see illness as a matter of bad matter. Matter and mother are the same. And so we associate the mother with matter. And the idea was to separate the divine from matter. Health is associated with the divine, that's separate from matter, and from matter. And so matter becomes the enemy. We persist in thinking of illness as a question of bad matter. Not a question of bad breathing or bad lifestyle or something, an invitation to change our life. It is treated by many people as an invitation to cut some piece of matter out of our body, cut a left lung out or something. And that hurts. Because it really is an invitation to change our life, our society. You don't heal something by cutting it out. When we take people into a hospital, we separate them from their everyday life. And we say to the world, listen, for this person, there isn't going to be any time. We're not talking about functioning 8 to 5 every day. All the issues that he normally does, we have to isolate him from. We put a hermetic seal around the person so that he would have a time to heal. Well, supposedly that's what a prison is. A prison is supposed to be a place of healing. It's a place where people go to be healed from illnesses or damage to themselves and to society. This is what hospitals are about. To take them away from the everyday life, to let them heal so that they can go back out into that world and be a healthy member of society. Unfortunately, I think we forget that fact sometimes. We put people in the hospitals to get rid of them. We put people into prisons to get rid of them. The issue is healing. How do we heal? There are many ways of healing, and some that this country puts their back on. When you're driving down the highway and you see on the other lane an accident, very few people don't want to look. You know, we struggle with this all the time. Should I look or not? You know, I don't want to see it, and yet we all try to look. Well, one of the reasons for that is that on some level, we understand that the human look, the human sight heals. Sometimes an illness can be healed just by looking, having somebody look at it. You know, like, gee, Mama, see my knee and how sore it is. And Mama looks at the sore, and all of a sudden, it's no problem anymore. It's just somebody takes a look at my wound. If you put these doctors into a situation where they have to process 25 of these cases a day, you know, it's like what a prostitute might have to go through. You know, I mean, it's hard to put your emotional hooks in any John that comes by. You process them like a factory, and so we got to look to the situation, not to the agent of the situation. Anyone you put them in a terrifying situation, and it's really unpredictable how they're going to act. It's a battlefield is a good training to see that connection. And, some people will treat it like a factory situation, where you're processing meat. Others will treat it as a mystery school, as a way of initiation into the deepest levels of spirituality. And for them, it's not a factory. They're not very effective, they're not efficient, and they have a tendency to lose their jobs, one way or the other, even on the battlefield. And a doctor who takes the time to really marvel at the miracle of birth would not be a doctor in our situation for very long. They would not function. So we have to understand the condition that doctors are in, and teachers and military people. When someone is into denial about something, know that underneath they really are consumed by that issue. I was watching something the other day about a northern African tribe in which the statement was, "A poor man shames us all." And the idea is that if you have in your community a person who doesn't have the means of support, that means your whole community isn't very wealthy. It isn't well off. And so if everybody is well off, you know, we can dance. But if there's one homeless, it's a statement on all of us, on our belief structure, on our economics. So the American people, in a sense, are very poor. And even money. In every way, they're poor, and they know that. Think about how hard it is to acknowledge your own inabilities. There is no culture that I know of is as hungry as we are. Hungry for spiritual connection. I mean, all around us we are told that we're cut off. But deep down inside, we know we're really not. We want that. We want that connection. The goddess thing is not a choice. And if we present the goddess thing as a matter of feminine mysteries, forget it. It's much deeper than that. It is part of my own soul. My soul, we're talking about. You're not going to separate me from my soul. That's what the goddess of Joy was about. Call it any name you want to. It's about the depths of my soul. One of the great meditations of the Celtic tradition is walking. Because when you lift your feet, see, the idea is that the soul of the person is in the bottom of their foot. We still talk about the soul of our foot. When that soul is pressed against the black earth, right? The old word for soul meant wound as well. And when that wound or that soul is pressed against the earth, we are healed. And then, because we are born to move, we lift the foot, we open our wound, we expose the soul, and we lift our leg with great effort until we get to a certain height in our step. And then the goddess claims us again and pulls us back to earth in gravity, which is her love. You know? And so we then put our wound back on the ground and heal our soul. And so this is a meditation of walking. When people are walking in this cherishing way, they understand. We used to say grief. Grief is when you're lifting your foot, and grace is when it's going back down. So you go through life in these series of griefs and graces. You don't just have grace. And you only have grief if you forget to come back down to earth. And so grace is like the rain. It can come in torrential form. It can water the flowers. It can wipe your garden out. But grace is like the rain. And you can't have grace without some grief. It's all the package. Because both manifestations are what she's about. We have to do what we are as a human being. And part of the way to worship her is walking in the wood. It's understanding that you don't need an intermediary between yourself and that flower in front of you. You don't need an interpreter. You don't need an interpreter of your own heart, your own history. Just be open to it. Don't tell her what she is. 2 miles on concrete is a long ways, right? But most people can walk a long time when it's in the dirt soil in the woods. But the farther you go, the more tired you become. You let go of what's all the noise that's in your head, your busyness. And at the end of the day, you can feel every stone in that pathway. You become attuned to everything that is around you. And so a good long walk introduces to you a full awareness of the goddess, which is something beyond your own thoughts. And so you become audacious. The old word was audacious. One has to be audacious. And the word audacious means to listen. Adi, to listen. The one who dares to listen is practicing spiritual life. It's not the one who's got his mind made up or has figured it all out. No, it's the one who listens to everything, to the child, to the wind, especially the wind. You ever noticed around a campfire at night when you've got storytelling starts? As the evening progresses, the shadows are kind of far away from the fire. But as the night progresses, the shadows get closer and closer into the fire, as if they want to listen to the story. And if their presence becomes even more known, and it can be distracting to one who only wants to hear the breath of the man telling the story. All these people, all these shadows, all these shades, all these spirits want to hear what this bard has to say. Everything listens. The spirituality is this submission, this ability to let go of our best and brightest. If I had this brilliant idea, it would pale in significance to what I could hear from you or hear from the wind. Rather than hang on to my hard-won pile of gold and my hard-won truth, I need to suspend this for a minute, this truth. If it's truth, it'll come back to me. But I need to look at what's underneath it. I need to see where it's coming from and how it might change. If I hang on to my truths, I'm not listening. And if Jesus was about anything, it was about listening to his Father, right? His mother, Father, to his source, to his El. And it's not telling El what he's going to do, or it's not saying what is absolute truth or false or what is evil. You gotta listen. You gotta listen. At one time, it was very important not to have anything over your head. No roof over your head. It had to be an open air. Uh, and that starts to change with Christianity. It's important to have a roof over your head at that point. And they would build these churches mostly on sacred sites. One, because they're attuned to the sites. And the way we are not anymore. Our churches are just warehouses, built wherever it's convenient. But in earlier days, they were built on sacred sites that the people would recognize as sacred. And as if to say, well, this man Jesus is not that much different than what your earlier heroes were like. So they were accepted there. But I don't think that the goddess wants us to tear anything down. She's the master. I mean, things last as long to the second that she wants them to be there. The man who destroyed the Pieta took a hammer to the Pieta, the great statue, the great carving of Jesus and Mary. I think his name was Toth. I'm not real sure. But he described why he did it, why he took a hammer to this great work of art. And he said he wanted to free artists everywhere because artists lived in the knowledge they could never do anything nearly as good as the Pieta. And so they were terrorized. And he wanted to free artists. And so the hand of the gods, in part, was behind this man's arm hanging onto that hammer. He put a flaw by smashing the face of the Pieta. And now artists have been released everywhere. They can dream of doing something greater than the Pieta. So even that act is a gift